Thank you, John. Is the microphone working? I'd like you first to notice that there is a certain kind of resonance between James Osh and me. Our first slide, this is what most people call a coincidence. Are there any coincidences? First, I'd like to say thank you very much to Professor Bill Nelson and Desiree, and to John Kelsey, and to Sue Rado and the entire crew that's put this thing together, to all of you, of course. And of course, I should also mention that I find it quite a privilege to be following so many hard acts to follow. So we'll see what transpires. I'd like to talk to you about the PAIR program first, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Program, which really was from 1979 until just last year, one of the places where you could find, as John says, some very solid engineering-based, what we call unimpeachable kind of research. There are people out there who wish to impeach it anyway, but what do they know? When we look at the data from the PAIR lab, we begin to see that intention is real. It matters. I think in a certain sense, all of us know that from the very beginning. And because of our training in healing modalities and various kinds of intentional sciences, we become very clear about that. Nevertheless, it's nice to see some data that come from hard-edge kind of scientific sources. After an introductory march through the PAIR lab, its history, and some of the kinds of things that we found there, I'm going to then move to the Global Consciousness Project, which is where I spend all of my time now, and some pretty remarkable findings, not least among them what I consider to be the absolute unimpeachable proof that we are all connected. Teilhard de Chardin somehow lost a few letters out of his first name and substituted a B. Okay, de Chardin proposed that there is such a thing as a noosphere, a shell of intelligence for the Earth, and that we are it. Only we are not finished with the evolutionary process that brings us there. Teilhard was a scientist as well as a theologian, and wrote beautifully. Among the things that he wrote was a kind of path through evolution, starting with particles, and then small clusters, molecules, and eventually living molecules, complex molecules, small animals, and ultimately human beings. But he said it isn't quite ultimate, it's penultimate. He said we have another stage to go. And that was his way of describing what I think we may begin to see as at least a beginning glimpse of this shell of intelligence for the Earth. So what evidence do we have that there's anything like this going on? I think that intention and the interconnections among us, mind and matter, are a very important set of interconnected topics. And that's what the PAIR program is about. So first I'm going to talk about what we did there and how that developed into various other parts. There's a kind of, in my view, a stepwise development. First, the laboratory research, and then what we call field REG, or field studies, where we went out into the field with little tiny versions of random event generators and started looking for what we eventually had to understand as a kind of consciousness field. And we've been talking about that in various other guises already. And James has given you some pretty nice descriptors for that. And the book that he mentioned, Lynn McTaggart's book, The Field, really focuses very strongly on exactly this kind of field. Except that the theory may not be quite valid. So we begin to gather data.
The laboratory experiments are all about intention, and the field studies are beginning to be about resonance. And the global scope that we'll eventually get to is about a kind of coherence and resonance that's created apparently by shared engagement in important matters. I should also mention that I'm going to do 3 parts. The first hour or hour and a half will be about the Care Lab. The second part will be about the Global Consciousness Project. And the third part will be a kind of practicum where we can try to intentionally influence the behavior of a random event generator. Some of you may have already tried that, but if you haven't, it's fun. I have a device that's already connected to the machine, and it is now recording. The computer is recording data, which we can also look at later, assuming the equipment works the way it's supposed to. And I have no reason to believe it won't. So, in any case, we are now being recorded, this group, to the extent we become resonant and kind of share a consciousness. We may see a kind of divergence from what's expected. The data from these devices, the way we plot it, usually runs along a kind of random walk that has no trend. A level kind of wandering about as if it's a drunkard trying to get home, but he doesn't know where home is anymore. And so he takes steps in random directions, makes essentially no progress. What we see in contrast to that, in situations where intention has had an effect, or where a consciousness field develops because we are in resonance, is a trend away from this level expected line. It may go upward or it may go downward. If it goes strongly enough, if it's persistent and consistent, then we can demonstrate with statistical evaluation that something has happened that shouldn't happen. Random data become non-random. I'll talk a good deal more in more detail about this later. The laboratory at Princeton really, in a certain sense, was a kind of development stage for tools that could be used for consciousness research. A lot of the time we spent, much of our time we spent in mind-matter interactions, the experiments where you intentionally try to change the way a machine works. A lot of other time was spent in what we call remote perception. Many of you have heard of remote viewing, maybe less of you have heard of remote perception. It's the same thing. Only we decided to be open-minded and say it isn't just viewing, maybe it's olfactory. As James said, there are vibrations on all levels that we may be perceiving. This is a picture of one of our machines. It's located in a kind of living room space. The lab was set up to be comfortable. Had a great big orange plushy sort of couch about the color of these things. Across from that machine, which we call the random mechanical cascade officially. And what it does is drop 9,000 3/4-inch plastic balls through a matrix of pins. They bounce this way and that way, and eventually they form a kind of distribution at the bottom, which you can see. And so it was called a pinball machine, of course. Now, on the right-hand side, under this dark door, is a conveyor belt that brings all the marbles to the top. And there's an opening there where they come out, and there are counters here. And the whole thing had so many mechanical parts that it was sure to malfunction occasionally. What's Murphy's Law? If it can, it will. And it frequently did. So our affectionate name for this machine was Murphy. Most of us loved it very much. Some of us said, that clatter is too much for my thinking. I have to leave. So we produced data which were pretty remarkable on a machine that's 10 feet tall and 6 feet wide and with these great big balls. Some people say that's macroscopic. I'm not so sure. You know, the REGs, the random event generators, use electrons, very tiny. You can easily envision, perhaps, the kind of interaction that could change the way an electron moves. But how about a 3/4-inch marble? And it turns out that it may not be a matter of pushing the marble, again, I refer back to James' observation that it isn't a force, it's a change in the movement. So these balls are bouncing around in this peg, and occasionally we bounce twice on one peg. I made a fast action movie once and saw that once in a while they bounce 3 times on one peg. So, but then they finally must decide to move this way or that way. What's the difference between this way and that way? Anybody know? Is it a force? It's really information. It's a bit of information. So maybe what appears to be macroscopy isn't really. We had quite a number of beautiful and interesting machines, a pendulum that had, for its pendulum bob, a crystal ball. We wanted to make things enjoyable, beautiful, aesthetically pleasing so that people could connect to them. We had a fountain. I never was able to get a really good picture of the fountain, but it was a jet of water that went up, splashed, and at first it's a neat, orderly, what we call laminar flow, completely organized, but at some point it stops being completely laminar and organized and becomes turbulent, then splatters, breaks up, falls apart, and becomes what we think of as a kind of beautiful fountain. So people try to change that point to make it break up and become turbulent sooner or later in the experiment. Several others, including one pretty interesting. We had a great, beautiful drum from the Southwest Indians in America, but we rigged it up with a drum beat that was random. It was controlled by one of our random event generators, and instead of being the normal, proper rhythmic drum beat, it was a little like glitchy. And our idea was that we're built to do rhythm and that sort of thing. So internally, at a subconscious, subspace level, maybe there would be a kind of motivation to fix it, to change it, to make it less random, to change the entropic content of the series of drum beats. So we had a lot of fun building and eventually testing a great many interesting kinds of experiments, some of which are so beautiful that they should be in museums as art pieces. Here's a quote from Jessica Utz, who is a statistician of note, highly regarded in the mainstream statistical community, but she pays attention to what's called parapsychology, the psi research. She said in some place that designing a flawless experiment is extremely difficult and carrying one out may be impossible. But we try. And so I now want to give you just a little bit of the basics about an REG because we're going to be talking about them quite a bit. We start off with, these are, people know about random number generators in computers. It's a program that makes random numbers supposedly. But those are pseudo-random. We need real random numbers, what people call physical random sequences. So we start out in one of several different designs. They're all similar in some respects, with a quantum level process, which is electron tunneling. Over here, there's a diode or field effect transistor or some kind of device that has a solid state junction, which is a kind of switch, should allow electrons to flow one way and prevent them from flowing the other direction. And what we do is set up a circuit that pushes the electrons against that barrier. Some, James mentioned this also. Sometimes an electron will go from one place to another place without being in between. So it can go through a barrier called electron tunneling. And it produces a tiny voltage on the other side. These passages, the electron tunneling moments, are completely unpredictable. So the amount of electrons that build up on the other side is also unpredictable. It will rise and drop in magnitude. The voltage can be measured and sampled. If it's higher than a certain mean level, we call it 1. If it's lower, we call it 0. So that's the basics of a physical random event generator. It requires some electronics to do some counting and a little bit to change these in, shift the bits into bytes that can be transmitted to the computer. And then you have a sequence of numbers that are completely undetermined, unpredictable from one moment to the next. And that's a kind of definition of random sequences. Independent numbers that are completely unpredictable from one step to the next. This is just a picture of the inside of our first, where actually it's the second generation, but I show it just because it's kind of nice to see how much work can go into also a lot of money. That's probably $50,000 or $75,000 worth of engineering time and effort. This technology for generating random numbers has been developing over the last few decades, and by now we have really reliable, well-calibrated random devices that are suitable for connecting to computers and being used in experiments that you can depend upon. They're more and more sophisticated, and ultimately the intent is to make it possible to ask sound questions about this business of mind-matter interaction. And that's the whole business of PAIR for almost 30 years. I want to give you now just a little introduction to what you see when you do the experiments. What do the data look like? In PAIR experiments and also the other ones I'll be talking about today, our typical procedure was to take one trial every second, and each trial was composed of 200 bits, that is 200 coin flips, you might say. Throw 200 coins in the air, count the heads every second. We could even have taken data faster, and sometimes did, to find out what happens. But the typical thing was to take these trials every second, which would have a mean value or an average value of 100, very close to that, with a little bit of variation that is known and expected because of the variability of random numbers. They would range up to 125, maybe down to 75, once in a while a little further, but most of them are in this range from 80 to 120. And you can't see quite in that previous picture how predictable these random numbers become if you take them in large numbers. But here's what it looks like when you have 1,000 of these with the expectation of 100 right in the middle. And this blue curve, or the smooth curve, is a Gaussian expectation curve. You can see that the actual data fit that pretty well. That's the thing that we want to achieve in these experiments, because what we're going to now try to do is change the mean value, to shift that distribution of red bars one way or the other. And you'll eventually see that actually does happen. Now this is, as I was saying, this is what we expect from random walks, from random data. Sequence is kind of level. These bars up here, the smooth curve, are what we call a confidence envelope. What's inside is what's kind of expected, just ordinary variation. If it gets outside of that, it becomes, depending on how far outside, it becomes less and less likely that this is random. You can calculate the likelihood or the probability that what you're looking at is generated by chance. I should also mention, describe this cumulative deviation curve, because we'll be seeing a lot of them. What we're doing here is taking the expected value and then subtracting that expected value from each of, remember, we take 200 bits, the expected value is 100, suppose you get 102, subtract 100 from it, so you have a positive deviation of 2. The next time you get a 96, a negative deviation of 4. What we're doing is accumulating steps like that. Positive 2, negative 4, next one's 110, so you go up 10 points from where you were, and so on. And finally describe a curve that's really the history of the number of trials that you take. Is that clear? By the way, I should say, I think I have time. If somebody has a question or wants a clarification, probably you're not the only one, so please ask. Okay? So far I've been so clear. Or Is it utterly stupefying? We can't tell yet, right? All right, so this RAG technology for parallel is quite basic, and we use it in a variety of different kinds of experiments. This one is one that's typical, and in the practicum, I'll show you one that looks like that. This one is, well, what we're doing here in this experiment is asking people to try to push the numbers high. So what we want is for a random curve that eventually winds up high. This one does. It's not high enough to be significant. It's not outside the envelope, but it's already in the right direction. Here is a different kind of experiment that basically in the background is exactly the same. This one had no feedback. It just had a beautiful diagram to look at. And the Sri Yantra, which many of you are probably familiar with, a kind of sacred geometry. And one had the option of having that just stay there in a stable form, or to shift through different colors. Just something to occupy your mind in a certain sense, so that your intention could operate maybe behind the mind, under, in the subconscious, the subspace, because we came to believe, and do rather now strongly believe and have some evidence for, that's where the action is. It's not what you think and desire in this conscious sense so much as it is what's happening in the, I think, is subspace your invention?
I wrote the first book on it.
Okay, well, you didn't invent it, you just described it before anybody else did. I guess the subspace has been around much too long for anybody to invent it. Even those remarkable frogs know about it. This is, on the left, what we call our benchmark REG. You saw the innards of it a little while ago. It's a big thing. It's like a suitcase in size. It's on a table. At the time, we had paper tape recording as a kind of extra check. If we look at the computer data and something looked strange, we go to the paper tapes and confirm it. Didn't need to make adjustments very often, but security and integrity of the data is one of the watchwords of getting experiments in a subtle area, which people can depend upon. Without that, you could waste your time, and everybody else is. If you're making mistakes and nobody can tell that you're making mistakes, you may learn something that isn't true, or not learn anything that is true, ultimately. On the right is a picture of the same machine with a feedback display. Actually, that must be a data output, because nobody's individual data in each experiment looks quite that good. But this is what the accumulation of data looks like over time, when we have quite a number of people doing the same experiment in the same environment. In this case, we're looking at data from 33 different people. And what you can see is, first of all, that the baseline, which is a third condition that we use, we ask people to try to get high numbers in one condition, low numbers in another condition, and then we have a baseline condition in which people are supposed to let the machine do what it does, normally, naturally. I should mention, it turns out that people can't do that. So what they try to do is get good baselines. And remarkably, they're remarkably successful at that. We had, if you think of this distribution, this bell-shaped distribution, it not only has a mean that might shift, it has a width that might grow larger or smaller. In the baseline, that width grew slightly smaller. What that means is that people try to get as close to 100 as they could, and they succeed. They squeeze the distribution. A couple of other really, to me, extremely interesting things. You see that there's a kind of symmetry of positive and negative trend. If you look, here's a very strong positive trend. Here's a rather strong negative trend. There's a symmetrical match in the lower curve. So what it turns out causes this, or is at least correlated with this, is who's doing the experiment, or what the conditions are. For example, we had a person who, we had an option to do do the high, baseline, low in a volitional order. The person can choose, I want to do high now, baseline next. We added also a randomly instructed order. So the person was told what to do. That person succeeded admirably in getting the positive deviations for high numbers if it was the volitional condition and not if it was the instructed condition. So we thought, well, we have a personality detector here or something like that. But the operator, instead of calling him subject, we call him operator, said, that's not it. It's really just that the volitional condition is very comfortable, easy. I don't have to contend with something that wasn't what I expected or intended. So that was, we of course have a great deal more work. When we have a beginning insight, we need a great deal more work to find out what the real meaning of the insight is. This same experiment continued for 12 years. And the part that you saw that I just showed you is over here. And in this 12-year series, there are 522 complete experiments, what we call a series, and 91 different people. The probability, you can see the tendency for the highs to be high and the lows to be low continues. It wasn't a flash in the pan, or as some people worry about in these kinds of experiments, hit the first time and then decline until you finally have nothing left. Instead, over many years, this experiment continued to produce this sort of positive result. Here, by the way, is the size of the effect in terms of the Gaussian distribution. I said the intent is to shift the distribution one way or the other. This is a combination of both the high shift, this is success in the direction of intention. So you can see that even with both of them being successful, the difference from the actual change is so small that it's hard to see until you do things like these cumulative curves. That's why we use it, actually. It makes it a lot easier to understand what has happened. There's also information there about how good the fit is to chance, which is it's not. It's not a very good fit at all. This kind of shift is not huge, but it's extremely improbable. It's like I think it's like 1 billion to 1, probably. There are all kinds of interesting bits and pieces in the data. We, for example, mentioned that we had this volitional versus instructed kind of choice of what to do next. We also asked people if they were interested. By the way, I should mention that people are not people who claim to be psychics. They're not making a living as pushing things around with their minds. Instead, they're just, as far as we can tell in most cases, what I suppose you can call ordinary people with an unusual interest. They were self-selected, so it's not so surprising they were overall successful. It turns out about 15% of the, say, 90 or 100, or we actually had quite a number of other people in still other experiments, but about 15% of those people succeeded in doing something that's impossible, which is, doesn't maybe sound like everybody can do it, but I think everybody can do it. One of the questions we're often asked is, can this be taught? Can you learn to do it? What's the, what are the secrets? That sort of thing. And as far as we can tell, and although there are claims that it can be taught and it can be learned and so forth, my guess is, and I think most of my colleagues would agree, is that what really can be learned is to get out of the way, is to relax and accept what's going on in the experiment, rather than learning some trick. It's not a trick. It's like learning to be healed in a way. At least I think probably most of you are more familiar with that than with REGs. But what you have to do in healing is get rid of the ego, get rid of the preconceptions, move on into a subspace, into a frame where those things don't matter, but what does matter is the connection. A lot of other things were, could be looked at. I mentioned that we could take data faster, and we did. And it turns out that there's a very slight increase in the size of the effect that you get if you increase the amount of data by, say, a factor of 10. It's not a linear kind of thing at all. There may be a slight increase. We never were even 100% sure that it's a real increase, because the difference between 2,000 bits per second and 200 bits per second was so small. It was in the right direction to say, oh yes, more data, faster, and you'll get better results. But it's such a small effect that I think we're forced to at least be open to the possibility that what counts is something else. Not how fast the data accumulates, it's how good the connection is to people in the experiment. This is a picture of what we call a kind of series position effect. When people first come in, that spot there is the first experiment that a lot of people did. We just took, if they did 10 or 5 experiments, we looked at the first experiment for everybody. And it gives a pretty much a considerably larger effect than number 2 and number 3. If we stopped at that point, we might say, oh, well, it's just going away. It was just an accident. This is statistical regression to the mean, and nothing more there. But because we were in business for such a long time, and we, from the beginning, had this idea that the best thing we could do is pursue this with integrity and a lot of patience. So we had 5, 6, 7 series, and here you can see that after a rather significant drop at the beginning, it comes back up, and after a while, this is the average of all the series that were done. So ultimately, this is a kind of interesting piece of information. There may be a dropout, but it isn't a final answer question. Instead, it's a stage from which we should learn something. We're not quite sure what. So the bottom line for this 12-year experiment of REG class experiments, and I told you really only about one. We had about maybe 10 or a dozen different experiments that were in the same general territory. There are 2 different kinds. There are ones with truly random sources and experiments that had what we call a deterministic source. That's the pseudo-random computer algorithm kind of numbers. And I'm sorry, this is just numbers. I should have a graph for you. But this is evaluation by some different methods. But if we just take, let's say, the first one, the random experiments have a probability on the order of 6 times, so a few parts in 10 to the minus 10. That's a big number. That's a few parts in 10 billion, right? So that's impressive. The deterministic experiments, on the other hand, have a probability of about 0.7, meaning, we think, at least in the first cut, we didn't have such a big database from those to be really sure. It looked like the mind-matter interaction is not capable of interacting with the deterministic sequence. What that means, the deterministic sequence, is that once it's started, it doesn't change. It's a computer algorithm. So the first number and the second number are related by an algorithm, and the third and the fourth. So if you ever have when you start it, it will produce the same thing every time you start it from that point. In the contrast, the true random sequence, remember I said, is completely unpredictable. That first number tells you absolutely nothing about the next number or any other number down the stream. So there's a real difference there. And maybe, again, taking one of James's observations is something like there's a little space between one number and the next where you maybe the consciousness can enter in. I'll talk much later about what little bit of kind of theoretical speculation I'm personally able to come up with that I think makes sense. But for the meantime, we're looking at a lot of data from a variety of different kinds of experiments, all of pretty much the same thing. If there is a truly random source at the basis of the experiment, then it's amenable. I'm tempted to say vulnerable, but that makes it sound like there's maybe something wrong with it. So it's just amenable to an interaction with us, with our intention, our being. Or another way to put it is that there is an interconnection or connection that is quite real, and which, in the right circumstance, we actually can see. This is just the name of several of the experiments. Because we're in an engineering school and had access to people that use really fine, high sensitivity equipment, we could bring those in and use them as targets in our experiments, which sometimes was turned into a long-running experiment. Other times it was very difficult, just too hard to make the experiment work in the time that we had available. The top one in the list here, the Fabry-Perot interferometer, was a beautiful thing. Interferometers are used for measuring angstrom or sub-angstrom distances. They're used for measuring things like the speed of light in a situation. The one that we were using had produced, used sodium light, so it was yellow light, and it had two partially silver mirrors. The yellow light would come through and bounce, part of the light would bounce back and forth in between these two mirrors. Part of it would go on through. The detectors over here would then get a few photons that came through the first time, and then a few more photons that originally were exactly coherent with the first one. Now they're delayed just a little bit. So we had waves of bright and dim light, which were concentric circles. It was gorgeous. And we asked people to change the spacing of these rings, to expand and contract the ring. One of James's slides had the expanding and contracting waves look exactly like that. And people were successful, but it took us almost all day for two people, an experimenter and an operator in the experiment, to do one data point. So that was really too expensive, and eventually gave it up, even though it was producing strong results. It was, as somebody observed, a lot of fun. Here's another one that was especially a lot of fun. We had a little tiny robot, and we put a random event generator on board with a program that could be used to decide whether it should rotate to the right or to the left, and how many degrees, and then how far it should proceed in the direction that had been set by the rotation. And I don't think you can see it. I wish you could, because it was a beautiful little frog. The green thing is what we call the primordial frog. He was like very acute frog. And he was riding this as if it was a Zamboni, the thing that they clean up the ice rinks with. So the experiment, as you may guess, was to try to get this frog to come to you. So the person would sit on one side of the table. There's a camera overhead that's looking at a diode on top of the robot, so we could draw a map of all the excursions the thing made, and ultimately calculate exactly how close the frog came to coming to me. And occasionally we had children. At Princeton Conservative Place, we couldn't really run formal experiments with children. There's just too much, review board stuff to deal with. But we had visitors, kids that wanted to see a scientific laboratory. And as my friend Brenda Dunn, who was the laboratory manager, often said, the mainstream laboratories are too busy. So we're not too busy. Let's bring the kids in. And they had a ball with all the experiments, but this one they loved. They were hugely successful, as you might guess, in getting the frog to come by. This is the Murphy machine I showed you before. And I guess I talked enough about it, but it was a delightful device. We sat on this couch that I mentioned for 12 minutes roughly, listening to the clatter of these balls bouncing results correlated with the intentions. Rights and left were separated by a huge and significant amount. And then we found some other odd things. It was mainly the rights were highly separated from the baselines, and the lefts were not so much. So the baselines were sort of the standard against which both were measured. The one difference was big. The other one, in fact, so big that it by itself was significant. And the other one was much smaller. So there's a kind of asymmetry that we can see here. You might have noticed in those graphs I showed you previously of the overall results, the high intention is a little stronger than the low intention. And I bet anybody here can guess why. Which is better, right or left? Which is better, high or low? And so forth. I mean, there is no better, you know, but we have these kind of automatic responses. Things works, the meaning. They're deeply buried, we don't know what's happening, but they are there. So we think it's entirely possible that's why we would get these asymmetries in these experiments. And among the things that we discovered were that the asymmetries might be individualized. My asymmetries would not be the same as yours, but in the long run, we tended to agree that somehow right is better than left, high is better than low, at least in these experiments. This is the data from this pinball machine. It's 10 to the minus fourth, the ultimate probability. And that's the difference between the right and the left. And I misspoke. It's actually the left that is really powerful compared to the baseline. But the ultimate result is that this bottom line says it works. If people wish for those balls to fall more in one direction than they should by chance, it happens. This is an experiment that I had in mind when I said that some are so beautiful they should be in an art museum. This had a clear acrylic box about this high and about this square, and inside it this pendulum with a crystal ball for a bob and a rod made of fused silica which has no thermal coefficient of expansion. So if the temperature goes up or down, it doesn't matter. The pendulum doesn't become longer. And in swinging in air on bearings so good that it would swing for 1,000 times back and forth like this, gradually slowing down. We took runs of, as I recall, something like 200 swings. It would start with a swing like this and gradually slow down somewhat. And we had a double razor blade passing through a pair of diodes. And the edge cutting the light beam was measured by a clock precise to 50 nanoseconds, which is so precise that we could see the difference, even though the difference is not great. We could see the difference between one swing and the next swing. And that difference was what we were asking people to change. We literally asked people to slow it down more or to keep it swinging as long as possible. And people, I think, I did myself, thought about things like getting the air to be thicker or thinner. Molasses, I didn't think I could really produce molasses consistency in the air, but the idea was to change the damping rate. And again, people could do that. People did succeed in getting data. Here again, we're measuring the high versus low against each other, and you can see that, the dark curve here is a high minus low difference. And again, there is an asymmetry. Exactly why, we don't know, but it probably has to do with personality. So now I'm going to take us out of the laboratory into the field for what we call the field reg experiments, field REG. This required a number of things to happen. First of all, we couldn't take this box. It had attendant equipment, moreover. But eventually, we built a little box, a couple inches tall and 6 inches long. And that we could take out into the field with a battery and so forth. And later, we built a really small one, actually even smaller than this, which is the one that we're using just now to record data. and a palm-top computer. So it's possible to just put it in your pocket and go someplace like a church or a sacred place or a convention of some sort or a business meeting and so on. So we did go to places that we thought would have a kind of resonance or coherence, tendency to produce that. Rituals, if you think about rituals, what are they? Ancient means of bringing people together, sharing kind of experience. So it turns out that rituals are powerful determiner of the trend in our REG data traces. To me, not so surprising, but in terms of what you expect from the mainstream kind of physics of how things work, it's pretty surprising. We also went to places like shopping centers and parking lots, and which, as you can, I think probably everybody would agree, are not places where you're going to find a lot of resonance and coherence. Gambling casinos also do not produce, even though there's a lot of excitement there, maybe. So this is the size of the kind of REG that we can use in these field experiments. Fits easily in the palm of your hand. You can easily enough imagine putting it on a palm-top computer. Now, this is a picture of Robert John, who was the founder of the PAIR laboratory. He was, or is, a pretty charismatic speaker. I don't know if any of you have met him, but he's one of those people who can actually speak full sentences. No ums and ahs, and they're coherent from one end to the other, and they may be pretty complicated. In any case, he's the reason the PAIR lab existed. He was the dean of the School of Engineering, and because of that powerful position, he was able to establish a lab that many other faculty members really didn't want to see. And he was able to keep it there for those 3 decades, largely because he was an astute political thinker and willing to commit his time and energy to that. So this is one of the early field REG data collection. We had what was called an Academy of Consciousness, invited people from around the world, mostly from the States, but probably 40 or 50 people, including some whose names you recognize. Fritz Albert Koch, for example, was one of the people there. And in any case, several people gave talks, or many people gave talks. This is a picture of the data during a day when Bob John gave a talk, and it was about how mind really exists in the world. Not brain, mind. And what we're seeing here for most of the day is a kind of wandering, random walk like I've been describing before. But look at this period of time here. Instead of wandering in a level fashion, this is a little probability envelope here just for that period of time. It goes remarkably far out of the envelope. It's just highly significant difference. And as far as anybody can tell, there's no artifact, no accident. It really is because people were brought into a resonance during this talk. Here's some more examples of what happens when you go out into the field. On the left is and what I think probably for me, definitely I think for my wife, Lefty, also was a numinous event. We met a Shoshone shaman and walked around this Devil's Tower, which is a beautiful natural monument in Wyoming, many times because this whole business was organized by a dowser who wanted to see if the REG would respond to the places the dowser believed from his dowsing were energetic places. And I don't have a picture of the data from that. It's not as clear as this picture. The Shoshone shaman's personal mission was to heal sacred places that had been damaged by thoughtlessness and that sort of thing. And so he was planning to, and he did, pick a spot, what he called a power spot, to do a ceremony, to So he did a ceremony that was about 20 minutes long, where he chanted and sang and smoked herbs of some sort, and sort of brought us into this circle, sort of very small group, but we were, I think, resonant with his purpose and engaged in what he was doing. So this data trend here, which you can see is not a level trend, is what happened during the shaman ceremony. I had to explain what we were doing, and he said he didn't really know what I was talking about. And then we took a break from a cold, rainy day. I showed him that picture, and he said, now I know what you mean. A few years after that, I went to Egypt with a group of people who were all interested in the spiritual, the ancient tradition, the spiritual understory in Egypt. So we went to the temples, and we knew ahead of time that we would be doing some chanting and meditation in the Holy of Holies if we could do that. And we would go into the Great Pyramid, into the inner chambers and so forth. And again, we were planning to meditate or chant as appropriate. So this is a picture of the data taken in the Great Pyramid. Here, this first segment is going from the entrance, which is a crack, a place where I cracked it open, into the Queen's Chamber. And at that point, the data began to take off. This is a segment we were in the Queen's Chamber. The next segment, we were in the Grand Gallery and had a beautiful kind of spontaneous ceremony of calling people up. This is a great stairway up to the King's Chamber. And then we were in the King's Chamber for 2 meditation periods, and that's those 2 segments. I think just from the little experience I've given you so far, you can see those are not random traces. So exactly why is up for grabs a bit, but it seems to me that the combination of the sacred site, the spiritual intent, maybe the chanting and meditation, and the resonance that we were sharing as a group, all combined to make something that is really clearly non-random. Those data are among the most powerful we have in the field REG data set. This is a picture just of 15 or so separate kind of experiments of this sort. The expectation is that there should be a kind of level trend in such data, but one after another, these data taken in a place where we think resonance will be produced, produce a kind of deviation, and it adds up to a pretty significant set of data. We have actually mentioned these already, but this was the sort of, you might say, second generation random event generator. We made a bunch of those and gave them to other people and used them in a variety of different experiments. And then eventually we made a still smaller one and made and sold, or actually we didn't, but a small company made and sold quite a few of those for use in experiments like ours around the world. And in the lab, one of these boxes was connected to a computer that didn't do anything else but take data continuously, kind of completely in the background. And the idea that we had was that if there was another experiment happening in the same room, would the intent for that experiment sort of leak over into this continuous running device? And we had a number of other potential applications for it. And it turned out to be fortuitously running while during what I myself perceived to be a major event in the world. Lefty and I were traveling in Germany. Actually, we were there for a long period of time. We were sitting watching television news when they announced that Prime Minister Rabin had been assassinated in Israel. And so this machine is in Princeton. The event is in Israel, and we're in Germany. But I marked down the time, and resolved to look at the data taken around that time. And you can see again a trace that's not random. Right at this moment is when the murder itself occurred. And there's something maybe especially striking in that this, the data, you could say this is still random, but somewhere in here it begins to be quite clear the data aren't random. And that's some minutes before the actual event of the murder. We can't construe a single case like this as a real, proof of the principle, but this is a kind of suggestion that we should look at data before the event, just as in that presentiment experiment James described, where you look at the pictures and one that's exciting may produce an effect beginning before the picture actually is selected or shown. Yeah.
What's the time scale?
I'm running, sitting in the corner, taking data from one of these little random event boxes that we weren't using for something else. We were using only for that continuous running RG experiment. So,
Did you have any data on 9/11?
yes, I'll show you that later. We're getting close to the kind of break time, but maybe a few more minutes, and maybe we'll ask some questions. And that's a strong focus in the second part, which is the global consciousness experiment. Thanks. It's a really important. I'll just mention that the data started changing 4 hours or 4.5 hours before the first plane hit. So this is something you look forward to. But of course, we don't have real explanations other than the ones that we speculate and imagine. Those are beginning to form, though, a kind of interesting potential theoretical matrix in their own right. The next step in moving toward that global consciousness project was that when Princess Diana was killed in Paris, there was a huge outpouring of interest, passion, and lots of other emotions. And the funeral, we knew the plans for the funeral ahead of time. And I asked all the people, my friends and colleagues that do work with these REGs, please collect data during the day of the funeral. We will combine all the data and see whether there might be some kind of response on average in these many data lines. So we had, I think, 12 independent random event sequences, just like the ones we've been looking at, from in Europe and the States. And I gathered them all together and did the same kind of cumulative trace as we've been looking at. And this red line represents what we saw. The probability is about, I guess, on the order of 1 in 100. So in other words, if you did this 100 times, once you would get such a strong deviation by chance. So it's not a proof positive, but it looks very much as if what was going on in the world at that time affected our random event generators in Europe and America. None of them have to be in London, by the way. Closest was Edinburgh. It had the biggest effect, but we don't think distance even matters in these things. The idea of non-locality is a very important idea. The green traces at the bottom there are all just control data. This often in these kinds of results, you're looking at a natural experiment in a way. A natural thing happens in the world. You take data. You wonder if there's something wrong with your system when it looks as strong as it does. So then you run a lot of data through the system without the event, and that constitutes a kind of control data background. So we're beginning to work toward the idea that why not have something that's recording data continuously, like we did in the lab, and maybe in many locations, like we did in this kind of trial balloon prototype experiment for Princess Diana's funeral. And a bunch of parapsychologists and psychophysiologists, major European psychophysiologists, met in Freiburg. And the idea was that the parapsychologists could learn how to use EEG measures and various kinds of standard procedures in psychophysiology to find out what's happening in the human system when these unusual psychic or parapsychological experiments are going on. So in a certain sense, we were, among other things, looking at EEG measures. Several of us were standing around, and at one point, it gradually just coalesced, really. We said, why don't we do a world EEG? Instead of electrodes on a skull, we'll do random event generator sensors on the Earth body, in a way. That's ultimately what we wound up doing. My son, Greg Nelson, is a highly competent computer programmer and usually is outrageously busy. And he happened to have a period of time, and he liked this idea. And so he wrote the original software, developed the architecture for what I'll explain in perhaps in more detail later. And he said, so this thing is modeled after an EEG, but it's not an electroencephalogram, it's an electrodiagram. So let's call it an EGG, E-G-G. And that name stuck. It still sticks, even though we decided we should have a kind of calm, normal name like Global Consciousness Project for it. So nowadays we sometimes call it EGG, sometimes call it GCP, but the devices, which are just random event generators like we've been talking about, now in Fiji and in Taiwan and in Northern California and Southern California, just to make sure we get a proper sample, and so on. We have 65 or thereabouts running at any given time around the world, and they're, in a sense, connected just as electrodes in an EEG would be to a central computer that processes the data, stores it for later analysis. That's what we do too, except we've got each of these REGs on a computer that gathers the data and sends it in little batches to Princeton, where it's archived on a computer that gets analyzed. And then we can ask, what happens on 9/11? What happens during an election? What happens during the World Series? What happens when there's a murder of a prominent political figure? What happens when something shakes the world? That's the general idea of the Global Consciousness Project, which we will talk about soon. I love this saying from the Navajo. When you put a thing in order and give it a name, and you are all in accord, it becomes. There's a certain sense in which I believe that's operating at an ever broader level. Healing is, and the sort of alternative medicine in general, have a name. It's beginning to be a name that more people know, more people respect, and as that happens, it really becomes much more powerful. So, after how long? 30 minutes? 30-minute break. We'll come back and talk about glimpses of a global mind. I think we need, instead of going directly to the next round of proof positive that there's something amazing about the connections people have with the world that we live in, I think we should try it. I have set up an experiment, which we'll run part of. I think probably the whole experiment would take maybe 15 or 20 minutes, something like that. Maybe a little too long. This experiment will look very much like the one that was done in the Pear Lab with the big random generator that sat on the table. And it will have a high intention that we can choose, a low intention we could choose, a baseline we could choose. And what we'll want to do is all just kind of lean back and understand that we are all one, and we're even all one with a little gadget here, random event generator, producing numbers that could be faster, but producing these random numbers 1 per second. They're 200-bit numbers, so we'll draw a picture of the results. And what we'll be looking for in a graph you'll see shortly is a curve that may wander around sort of level, but we hope it will go high when the instruction that we've chosen is high. And we'll hope also high. I don't know what that means, but I hope it isn't a disaster. I guess it means we have to get started. So somehow we have picked a high intention. Are you cool with that? Because I think we can go back and take a low intention if we wish.
Roger, move out of the screen.
Pardon me?
Move out of the screen and get this.
Okay, the high intention. So the idea is just to relax and connect.
You're stepping in front of the screen. You can't see the screen.
I will get out of the way.
Okay.
And you all get out of the way too. What we want to do is see this machine produce high numbers. So with no further ado, it will start. Oh, actually it already started. Sorry. And it did high numbers for a little while. You see that? Can you see it well enough? I can't make it bigger, unfortunately.
We're looking at the red line.
The red line, and you want that red line to go upward. We are connected to each other and to the machine in ways we don't understand very well, but which, when we come to love those ways, we will get what we want. Love is a great connector. Roger should shut up. Okay, it has printed some results here. The z-score is 0.57. The deviation is positive, but it's too small to be significant in one run. So we can do another high run, or we can pick a low run, or we can even do a baseline to kind of let the machine relax for a while too. What is your vote? What would you like to do next? High. Okay.
We need a victim. We gotta vote somebody.
I think we're going to have to start chanting, folks. Let's go high. You can talk to these machines.
We need our polarity.
I guess you can't sing to the machine. Tap the side of your hand. Okay, this is slightly in the opposite direction. This is minus 0.44. So far, our accumulation is approximately null. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any difference between when people watch the results on the screen and when they're trying to do the same thing but they're not watching?
The question is whether there's a difference getting immediate feedback, basically. If you're not watching it, if you don't get any feedback, how does that compare with getting feedback? I showed a picture of the Sri yantra that we were using as no feedback. That experiment has a good would be a larger effect size overall. And we started doing that and other kinds of things of that nature because it seemed quite frequently to be the case that people do better when they don't know how to do it. I can actually turn the screen on. You want to try one that way?
Yes.
Want to try a high that way? Okay. Okay, we'll click the high intention. Huh. I'm going to just have to stand in front of it.
Move to the right.
Oh, did it go off?
Move to the left.
I have to go to the left.
Yeah. That's
Oh, there we go.
What's your shirt, though?
the shirt was.
My magic button didn't work.
Don't look at it.
Are we doing high?
Oh. Oh, no, we don't take it apart. We'll make do. We can actually do a simple thing like this.
What's the random chance that a fire starts through the bulb?
I just peeked. Sorry. I couldn't see what was happening, but I see that it is now finished. Now, we do not know how to explain these things at all, but just in case you have a hard time seeing it, we had a pretty nice run there for a little while. It was outside the envelope and definitely high direction. I peaked right at the point where it went the wrong direction.
Well, we all saw it at that point. Yeah. It's all,
Yeah.
we're doing well.
Yep. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm responsible for it.
Let's try it again.
Yeah, okay. You want to try it again with no signal, huh? All right.
Let's try going low.
Shall we do the low as a no feedback? Want to do a low with no feedback?
Yep.
All right. And I think I just, okay, I have to put the paper in front of it. unveiling or low run? Oh, well. You want to try a baseline? I think we should try a baseline. Now, I'm really curious what you might expect will happen with the baseline. Anybody got any idea? We shall see.
Well, we're trying out.
This is a baseline now. And what's supposed to happen is that we're not pushing the machine around. It's supposed to be allowed to do what it does normally, naturally. Baselines take a real long time. Well, it just seems like it. But the timing is exactly, it's very precise, so it's really not taking longer. You may detect that I'm a slightly impatient kind of person. And I'm probably the least likely candidate to be leading people in the proper mode for doing these experiments. So now we can look at the baseline and see how that came out. All right. Big hit. Would you like to do a couple more of these?
Roger, I thought you were doing that in the workshop.
What? Well, we just decided to switch the order of things. We'll talk about other things later. Yeah, I really will talk about the Global Consciousness Project. I think it's deeply interesting, but it is also extremely interesting to have a sort of direct contact with these kinds of experiments to see whether you can feel like you're making a contact with a machine, with an electronic random device.
So what might make us better as a group?
Say it again?
What might make us better as a group? In terms
Well,
of
the kind of things I actually had planned to do was talk about what intention amounts to and ask you what you think it is first. And then go on to literally do some meditation. And lots of people don't. Almost everybody here probably meditates or does something like a meditation sometimes. And it really does put people in a slightly different frame, I think. And probably it would be, since this is now basically kind of the workshop, or at least part of it, we could do that. Anybody want to say what you think intention is?
Think about love or think about sadness. Be sad and see what comes up.
Think about
Love.
Think about love. Is that?
Or be sad and have those feelings and see what comes up.
So you're suggesting that to help us do what we're trying to do, we should maybe try to capture a feeling of love, something like that, and project that. Thank you. Yes.
Positive visualization.
A positive visualization. You want to explain a little bit more what that would amount to in our context?
What I was doing was, with my eyes closed, I was actually visualizing and seeing the line going down the side of my
Okay, he's describing a pretty standard kind of positive visualization. You're seeing what you wish to happen. Your intention is being implemented in an internal vision, and the expectation is, and as far as we can tell, this is true, that internal vision becomes external to some degree. You can't always win, but you can do more likely you can win if you visualize a positive outcome. Anybody else? Praying the word for God. Yeah. Basically, trying to invoke the spiritual, bring yourself into a spiritual mode in order to do something that connects you directly to the world, in which God is all present, or something like that, right?
I think it is a very peaceful and useful place where everything's sort of flowing.
A peaceful place and where?
Peaceful, neutral place where energy is flowing.
Where a peaceful place where energy is flowing. It's a basically lean back, allow the energy to flow through.
I think if you just have the thought, it's going to go up, and just sort of tell you that it's happening, and forget about it. Just let it go, don't think about it again.
Okay?
Just do some deep breathing then, and just let the thoughts go.
She's saying, establish the thought that it will go up, and then maybe drop away from that thinking and allow it to happen. I'll tell you a story about remote trials in a moment.
So what I'm hearing is everybody's doing something different.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
does that affect the fact that we're not producing a resonance because we're all doing something different?
You give me an opportunity to tell you something that's technical in a sense, but it's actually pretty important. I showed you data that indicate where people in general are successful in getting what they want in these experiments, but I also pointed out that sometimes it goes down when you're trying to go up. What we found, and this is just an established scientific fact, is that the effect size is really small. There's a tremendous amount of noise. The randomness is noise in the first place, and what we're doing when we're successful in these experiments is overlaying, on average, a very tiny signal of the intention on this big sea of noise. It's basically like looking for a little buoy that's out in the middle of the ocean. When you look this way, you won't see it. You look this way, you won't see it. Finally, you look exactly the right place, you see it. It's a very small signal in a large sea of noise. So the implication of that, which is hard to remember, is that even when it looks like you're not succeeding, you may be succeeding. And that sounds like weasel words, but it's a fact that when we show overall that people who are trying to get high numbers do, on average, ultimately get high numbers, that means even when we miss and get low numbers, that's overbalanced by the time that we actually hit. So the simple point is we cannot be surprised or should not be surprised if we don't get high numbers the first go around. Now back to I wanted to tell you this little story about remote trials. I went to a retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, whom many of you may know. He's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk who's pretty charismatic. I was there with 600 people in a tent, and I had arranged, we were going to be there for 3 or 4 days, I had arranged with people in the lab to do what we call remote REG experiments while I was gone. And the way we do those is for the person who's somewhere else to decide on the order of high, low, and baseline, and write that down and report it to the lab after the data are run. So that the correspondence between the intentions that I have will only be determined after the fact. So it's a good, solid, clean experiment. Okay? So I was now with 600 people in this big arena tent, and I felt a kind of disturbance over in the corner and got tears in my eyes. And it turned out I didn't know what was happening at the moment, but Thich Nhat Hanh came in with his entourage. And during the Dharma talks, which he gave several times, I remembered that I was supposed to do these remote trials, so I decided on my high, low baseline order, and then I went back to listening to the Dharma talk. So it took me 2 seconds how long, I don't know exactly, something like 2 or 3 seconds to make my decision, and then I left that altogether and listened to the Dharma talk. Those, in my personal database of experiments, are huge effect sizes. They're the biggest effect sizes, and I was 250 miles away from the machine at the time. So the question is a good one, or the suggestion is a good one. Establish the intention, and then let it be. Let it be in the subspace, the subconscious, the realm where these things probably really live. They don't live in our consciousness, they live in our unconscious, underconscious, subspace consciousness. Does that make sense to you? Probably everybody who's a healer has to do something like that. Yeah, get out of the way. That's what we need to do here.
Let's try it again.
Okay, let's try it again, and let's try that if it feels good to you. By the way, I should also mention that every person these 91 or 100 people who did these experiments had a personal style. We didn't try to tell them how to think about it or how to do it. Basically, we said, do it how you can. You will learn gradually how best to do it. But in a kind of general sense, do it how you can, but try to let it be. Relax, let it be. So we want to do a high again?
Yes.
Without feedback? Okay. Hey, good show, guys. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a high run. And actually, there's another point that we can make. It doesn't have to go outside the envelope to be high. What it has to do is be a little bit over the middle. If you accumulate, you can see one after another. It's a little over the expected value. Gradually, you become convinced that it tends to be a little over. And that adds up statistically to become a very improbable thing. We have had, I think, 4, maybe 5 high runs, and I don't remember now. Are there 2 or 3 that were high? 3 in the high direction. So at this point, we have a number of alternatives. We can go ahead and do this whole experiment, which is set up to have 10 high runs, 10 low runs, and 10 baseline runs. But as I said, it'll take, you know how much more time it'll take. And there are a couple of other versions of this experiment, more modern and more, I guess, engaging in a certain way. Would you like to see those? Okay, so we'll end this experiment prematurely on a high note. This is actually very new software, and if any of you are interested in trying to do this sort of thing, using this sort of thing in your work or for your personal thing, I can give you information about contacting the people that make this particular device and this software. So they have created 2 more games. These are not ones that we actually used in the Pear Lab, but they can be pretty interesting. There's one that's called Red Green, and I think I have it highlighted now. And if we launch this game, what we'll see is, we can read through the instructions and so forth, but basically what it will amount to is a spot that appears on the screen at a rate of, it can be faster or slower, but 1 per second, or maybe a little slower, depending on how we want to set it. And your intention will be to make it green, and to do that as often as possible. Sequences of green will gradually build up a feedback curve like the one we've been looking at, only you'll get this different kind of feedback while you're trying to do it. Best thing to do to explain this is just go ahead and try it a little bit. Now this is set for fairly fast rate. I think I'll run it at a slower rate to begin with. Something like 15 of these trials per second. And when we go, you'll see this little green square some of the time, and a red square some of the time, and the beat is for the success of getting green squares. Now, I set it to do only 10 iterations. I wanted to do more than that. Okay, what we want to do is get as many of the greens, and often in a row, beep, 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 like that. How was that for a demonstration? Okay. You need to stay with the machine here a little better, or just make more iterations to begin with. You can speed it up. That would seem to be working a little better there. Pretty good run.
The faster you go, the less I can think about it.
That's right. That's it.
Yeah. And we should really speed it up, huh? Maybe there's an optimum speed. Will go as fast as it can go. That sound like a gambling machine? Want to give it more iterations because they run so fast. Is that kind of interesting?
Yeah.
Does it feel like you could learn to do that?
Yes.
Maybe learn to relax? just reseal it. Okay, question?
Comment, this is manifestation training.
Okay, what do you mean by this? This is manifestation training.
What I've always heard is that in order to manifest things, that you set the intention, let it go.
Mm-hmm.
And learning how to be able to do that with this applies.
I think it probably does. And you state the insight that took us, I suppose, 12 years to really establish perfectly. You have to set the intention and let it go. The intention has its own life, and that's what we need, I think, probably to learn in order to manifest. Okay, you want to try this again at a slow rate, or shall we just go on to the other experiment now? What? Okay. Let's see. This other one I think you'll find very interesting. It has a quality that people have been talking about, and what it amounts to is a kind of circular movement. And this experiment, is designed to provide a. I'm going to go ahead and launch the game so you can actually see a larger picture of it. There's a circle here. You can see I think you can see arrows that are pointed in this direction or that direction. And the experiment is set up so that you select whether you want the rotation to be rightward, clockwise, or leftward, counterclockwise. And then, as you'll see, there'll be a bouncing ball moving in clockwise or counterclockwise direction. And it'll move that in accordance with how the random numbers come up. Basically, it's like a little bit separated from the numbers themselves, but you're seeing a motion that's determined by by your intention interacting with those numbers. So, what direction would you like to try first? Clockwise? I think that's called right. Okay. Well, you have to make it go clockwise. We have to. So, again, you set the intention and then let it go. Set the intention and let it go. Go yet? Okay, this has a z-score of -1. I'm not sure these numbers are coming up telling us the truth. I think that we came out about no. It was. I don't think we ever went all the way around. Right? You want to try another?
Do we want to go all the way around?
Well, the instructions for the experiment are pretty generalized. Basically, the intention is to make it go clockwise as much as you can. It means make as many steps going in a clockwise direction as you can, as we can achieve. It's a fairly straightforward kind of experiment, except that to me it looked like the numbers that are being printed there, which you probably can't read, are not actually telling us what happened at this point. Maybe there's some setting that I didn't set right yet. But this is a very new program, so it's possible it still needs a little work. Want to try the other direction? Leftward? Counterclockwise?
Can you hide it though?
Say it again?
Hide it. It seems like every time it went back, I had to bring my attention back to it, so I couldn't let it go. Because I'm watching it, and I'm watching the progress.
Okay.
So I would prefer if it was hidden and to see what the difference
Okay,
might be.
shall we hide it then?
Oh, well. That's the problem.
Oh, the only problem is if these numbers aren't really telling us the truth,
You watch.
then I watch. I really have to get out of the way, right?
You're the bias.
Okay, I'll watch and I'll cover the thing so that nobody else can see what's happening.
No, I want to see she close her eyes.
Oh,
Take it in front of your eyes.
well, it's happening, folks. It's going leftward. I know what I'll do. I'll cover half of it. How's that?
No.
Now, I'm going to quit from this stage for a moment because I think there may be some sort of setting that we need to look at. Like the circular slider is supposed to have 100 trials, but the last one was 212 trials. I don't know what happened. Okay, we'll try it again. Is the speed okay? We can make that a little faster or slower. You like it? Okay. So we'll go ahead and run the game. Which way do you want to go? Left? Left? Okay, we'll try left. Yeah, my perception is that, again, these numbers are not coming up telling us the facts. So we have to go by perception. My perception is it went a little bit right. Wound up mostly going right. Shall we go with the flow and try right? Sure. Okay. Did you hear that? So that means we won one. But this is a slightly incomplete program apparently. It's not telling us numbers, but it did give us some pleasant feedback at last. Shall we do some more of this? Does anybody have questions or something to discuss? Otherwise, we can take a break and then come back and do global consciousness. Yeah, I'm sorry, I wasn't able to hear that well enough to retransmit. understanding right, you know about an event on the 1st of June every year. 21st of June. Oh, it's solstice. We have looked at that a few times. In fact, I'm not sure I have a graph in the slideshow, but I might have. We had a very powerful effect last June 20th, 21st. Very powerful on the global consciousness network. It's like, even though this signal to noise ratio is small, that particular event is by itself significant.
Show us the global, go ahead and show us the global consciousness stuff. That should be good to see.
You mean rather than do a break?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, I'm game. Sounds good to me. So we'll close out this game. Figure out how cute. Does anybody need to have a break for any reason at the moment? If not, I'm really quite happy to proceed. Yes, on the Global Consciousness website, which I have made a slide. Somebody asked about where to get the pair things, and unfortunately the writing is red, but I can read it. And maybe anybody who wants to get more information.
Can you just make it white?
I tried, and for some reason this automatic slide. I could, but it'd probably take less time if I just. Can you read that at all? http:// the usual. And then for the pair website is www.princeton, www.princeton.princeton, .edu, and then a / tilde.
Why don't you put it on the board later?
This button actually works some of the time. / tilde and then pair. And there you would look for publications. And there, yeah, the website for the Global Consciousness Project is written in notes. So, we'll proceed. I'm promising here something like glimpses of the global mind that I think may be active forming. The Global Consciousness Project is now about 10 years old. This meeting I mentioned in Freiburg happened in 1997, and took us several months, almost a year really, to make everything go. But then we started taking data in August of 1998, and we now have a continuous stream of data with more and more of these devices around the world until now. It's an international collaboration. There are about 100 people involved at any one time. Some of them are what we call hosts. They host one of these devices connected to a computer in their home or laboratory, and it's connected to Princeton via the internet. We have pretty sophisticated software that really takes in, I mean, you probably know that you have to get updates for your software all the time. This software has been running for 9 years without any problems, which is kind of amazing. The tools that we use are the same REG technology that I've been talking about earlier. And in particular, it's sort of an extrapolation, in this case, of the global, of the field applications I talked about. We, as I mentioned before, created an electroencephalogram. It's just a fun name, but that gives us the egg title. and we identify these individual devices around the world. There are quite a number of them in Europe. We don't have one on St. Martin's, but we do have one in the Bahamas, and we have one we try to spread them out around the world. They only can be done where the internet exists, so it's very hard for us to find any place in Africa. We do have 2 eggs there. And the software in Princeton running on the server is called the basket. So the eggs report their data to the basket. And so, if something happens to one of these devices, we, of course, say it's a cracked egg. Or a broken egg. Depends on how bad the problem is. We look for deeply engaging global events. And those are pretty easy to identify if there is something that everybody knows about. Sometimes we look at things that everybody doesn't know about, but for other reasons, to learn more about what matters and what doesn't. But things like great celebrations, the major religious holidays, celebrations of solstices and New Year's and the 21st of June and so on. Those kinds of things do gather large numbers of people into what might be a kind of coherent group. And the question is, are we perhaps, by this rather unusual and unlikely technology, able to capture a glimpse of something like a global consciousness forming? The idea that Teilhard de Chardin had was that that's what we're here for. And he said, don't get impatient, maybe 10,000 years before we have anything like a global consciousness. But I'm personally convinced that because of the way things are converging in a lot of different social and very, very practical arenas, things like global warming, the fact that we have the internet, high-speed travel, cell phones everywhere, that these kinds of things are beginning to bring us together in such a way that we may, deep down in the individual consciousness, be connecting in ways that we don't perceive necessarily with others around the world. Sometimes we can perceive that. If you're in a really good meeting, if you are in a group meditation, these kinds of things sometimes really are perceivable. They create a perceivable, different frame of mind, or state of mind. And it's that, in a way, that we're looking for. This is a Google map, which is on the website. If you look up the noosphere.princeton.edu and look for the egg hosts, this map will come up, and you can point at that one and find out exactly where it is and who's running it and how long it's been running and things like that. So it's rather nice. By the way, I should mention that besides the hosts, there are also about maybe a couple dozen people who do a lot of work. They do things like program this Google map. I don't know if any of you have done that, but it's not a trivial matter to make something like that work. And there are a number of other kinds of things like that. For example, we have a real-time display, which if you are on the actual website and open up this real-time display, each of those blocks there represents one of the eggs out in the world. And there will be, every second, the block will change. This little patch of color here will grow or shrink, will become brighter, and if it makes a very big deviation, it'll get a red. If it makes a huge deviation, it will make a even brighter color. And it has sound, so it's got a kind of heartbeat going in the background at 1 per second. Some people put it on their computers and run it in the background. It's sort of nice. But it can be distracting because when you get a fairly big one like that, it makes not just a sort of clack sound, but it makes a gong. If you get a really big deviation, it'll make a huge, if you've got it connected to a sound system, it'll knock you over kind of gong. And these, each of these eggs is doing this constantly. So. Oh yeah, this particular display doesn't tell you very much about the composite of what's happening in the world. You can get if it starts dinging and gonging a lot, you can surmise that there's something going on in the world, but it might be pretty hard to find out what it is. What I'll go to pretty soon is how we do see if something really is affecting the network. Well, we'll see that. There actually is on the home page a little dot that changes color, and it changes, the sort of standard color is a neutral, but it will go either toward the red and sometimes become very bright red. What that means is there's a high coherence in the network. Sometimes it goes to the other extreme, the blue, but those are kind of rare. It gets out to those extreme points. Rather than find a spike in our data and identify what made it, we identify things that should make a spike, and then we look for that. It's scientifically better. In fact, that's the only way we can do really clean science. But I'll talk a little bit more about it as we get more into it. This is what the data look like when it's just coming in. There's this, at this time, well, there's only 48 eggs, but you can see nothing, right? This is really just chaotic and random. And so what do? Have to do a lot of statistical processing, and I'm going to just sort of step through a couple of steps to give you an idea of what's possible and what we do in order to make sense of these data. This is the same data you just saw, only now each of the individual eggs is plotted the way I've been talking about, this cumulative deviation thing. If it tends to be high numbers, it'll make one of these high-going curves. If it tends to be low numbers, more often than not, it'll make one of these low-going curves. And as you can see, more of the action is right in the middle than anywhere else. And that's what we expect from random data presented this way. If we make an average across all of these, it's maybe a little hard to see, but there's a dark dotted line here. I got arrows pointing to it in a couple of places. That's the average across all of these. So even though you can't see it, you couldn't see it in the previous slide, you can't even see it looking at it spread out like this. But if you do now just an average across all those, you can see that there is a deviation in the high direction here. And it's possible to do statistical calculations to find out whether that's a significant deviation or not. And when the average across all of the eggs coming in is significant, then we have a curve that looks like this. It tends to go in one direction and continue to do that persistently over a whole period of time, which may be a few minutes or it might be a couple of hours. In this case, it's the whole day. And it's Earth Day in 2001. This is what the data look like when they're just rendered. It's a flat, level trace. So there's a big difference between this and this. And if we get this kind of strong deviation often, or even more often than we should, more often than half the time a positive deviation, it gradually adds up to make a strong, clear picture that something is pushing these eggs to behave differently from the way they did. Or using James's terminology again, not forcing the eggs, it's changing their movement in a way. By the way, I looked at other Earth days. This might have been the first one we did, and I thought, well, let's look at the year before, because we had the data from the year before. And sure enough, there was another curve that looked just like that. And then I said, all right, the year before that, we had one that was just completely flat. So you do not always see the same thing. As I mentioned, what counts is having this unexpected, unlikely deviation more often than you should by chance. That becomes evidence that something about our consciousness is reaching out into the world and changing the way the world is in this very subtle way. So we look at natural disasters, terrible accidents, things like big plane crashes that make the news all over. The beginnings of the Iraq War, as an example. Things like New Year's, grand celebrations. We've looked at now 9 New Year's. Yes?
Think of something. Did you compare New Year's with going from 2000 and that year rate?
Yeah. And she's asking, I think, about the so-called millennium, right? That New Year change. well, we really expected that that would have an effect on the eggs, on the egg network, because we knew that it was just a big deal. Everybody in the world practically knew about it, and tremendous numbers of people, even if they don't normally celebrate New Year's, were looking at New Year's. They were wondering if their computers were going to crash. And as usual, New Year's went on. And I'll show you a picture later of what New Year's actually looked like. But to answer your question directly, it did. There was a clear effect on our data during that New Year's. And the way it looks, I don't have a picture of that year alone, but I'll show you a picture of the composite later. Basically, if you think of something like half an hour with New Year's right in the middle, and you have to take all the individual New Year's for each time zone and stack them up and add them together. Anyway, the picture looks like random walk, a deep dip right at midnight, which comes back up again. It's a very beautiful picture. And so basically what it's saying is that we're just doing business as usual, hanging out, having a glass of wine or whatever, but as midnight gets close, people start focusing on midnight. And they start thinking about that moment. And they start, planning to get close to their loved ones so they can get a hug or give a hug at midnight and so forth. So it becomes, when you see a picture, it looks just like that. The kind of movement toward a moment. Really pretty interesting. But a lot of our events are unfortunately tragedies of various kinds. Here is the Middle East, as unfortunately we all know, has been in a chaotic mode or a tragic mode for years and years and years. What we need for the Global Consciousness Project events to do these scientific examinations of data are events that are a little more sharply focused than something that goes on and on and on. And every now and then something does happen. We have a major, terrible tragedy. In this one is 2002, and there was a bombing on Passover, major holiday, at a big resort where a lot of celebration was going on. Many people were killed, and that's a pretty divergent trace by itself. Then a few days later, what happened? A response. A bombing in Jenin. The Israeli Air Force came in and bombed there. So both of those show some kind of response. This global network is saying something like, "Oh my God, there it is. We've done it again." Somehow it brings us all to a focus. It's not easy to say exactly why or which kinds of events, but great tragedies that focus us all in the same direction, great celebrations, and a variety of other kinds of things. And all that's required is that we all be focused in the same direction. Yes.
I was just wondering how much of it seems to be connected to media coverage, if there's any way to make any kind of correlation with it.
The question is how much it needs to be connected to news coverage, and it is a question that we asked early on, and one we should ask. There's at least a couple of ways you could think about the global consciousness. It might be something like that's really completely unconscious as far as we're concerned, that's happening at a level that we can't access. You might say it might be Mother Gaia's mind that's actually responding to things. That's one possibility. Another is just thousands and millions of people seeing the same newscast and therefore becoming, you might say, synchronized and thinking about the same thing in much the same way. And it's probably, in my opinion, a mixture of both of those things. We have not been able actually to separate it, but there are some suggestive things. For example, in several kinds of occasions and situations, we see a response from the network before the event occurs. Okay? So it cannot be the news that's actually forcing that. I'll show you pictures of a couple of those things. One of the most powerful such examples is the 9/11 event, which we'll talk about later. Another one is earthquakes in general. There are earthquakes that we care about because they're on land, and there are earthquakes, big ones, that we don't care about or don't even know about unless we're geologists, that occur in the middle of the ocean. The ones that we know about show up in our data. The ones in the middle of the ocean, we don't see them. That's already, and that the point relevant to your question is that we start seeing them approximately 8 hours before the main temblor of the earthquake, which is better than most of the technological instruments can provide. Not a very good kind of warning system because we still don't know where it's going to be or who should run. You know, so it's basically only capable of instilling, you know, now you should worry kind of thoughts in people's minds. Okay.
All those eggs in California is
Well, yeah, it's unfortunately, I mean, this global network really sees things globally. And there will be responses from all of the eggs around the world to whatever the event is. So we can't, we're beginning to zero in a little bit on localizing, but so far it looks like we're not going to be able to build a warning network this way. This is the first event that we actually looked at. It was so long ago that most of us will have forgotten it. But in 1998, there were two embassies in Africa which were bombed by terrorists. They were really the first of the huge outpouring of terrorist attacks that we're now, you know, looking at in the world. And I was traveling at the time, but saw these headlines and said, we had just started this network running. There, I said, let's look at this. Why? My idea is that it really, I mean, diplomacy until recently had the kind of rule, a set of rules. You had to let people talk. There had to be a way for communication to occur. And this just shredded that contract. We now diplomats were not safe. They couldn't be couldn't be in a protected environment, and thereby continue the communication process to diffuse things. This is very powerful. In fact, one of the biggest effects that we saw, and naturally was quite a good, forward-moving motivation. We said, okay, we got it. So, of course, the next event showed no effect at all, most likely, or very little effect. Sometimes we have events that are, I mean, it's really hard to interpret things very clearly, but this is the Concorde crash in 2000. Again, most people perhaps remember this. It was the end of the Concorde, really, in Paris. The plane took off and immediately crashed. And so this is a period of 4 hours from the time of that crash. The first 2 hours or so was a very strong deviation in one direction, and then the next 2 hours, something else. Later, I'll show you a graph that indicates this is not uncommon. Basically, what it suggests is that there is a change in the mood. First, we're shocked, surprised, amazed, horrified, a bunch of those kinds of things. And then, at some point, that mode or mood changes to something different. What we call it something like resignation or sadness. It's no longer the same mood, and perhaps our data actually respond to this change in a very global consciousness, however it's composed, whether it's us individually linked to each other or Mother Earth. It's a little hard to say. For those from the U.S., you probably remember, in April this year, a student brought in guns and killed some 30 fellow students and whoever he killed. It was such a shock that it took over the news in the States for a little while. And we see here from the beginning of from the time of actually the shooting was right in here, but there was one killing early on, and then he locked up the people in one building, and then proceeded to kill them all, and anybody get close to them killed himself, and then finally this is a total of 13 hours. Probably that's the period of time when the worst the tragedy was going on. Again, we don't know exactly, but it looks rather like that. It's a kind of correlation that we have come to almost to expect from these data. Not always, but quite frequently. Here's the most recent one we've looked at in Bangladesh only a few days ago. Back in November 15th and 16th, there was a huge hurricane that came in. Yes.
And watching this, the graph goes down and then it goes up, and if I'm following you correctly, what is happening to the people is happening to it seems to go down, and then the world becomes aware of it, so it seems to go up. So then you have,
Yeah.
is that what you're
That's what she's suggesting is that we have quite a few cases, we've seen several cases where during the time it's actually happening to people, the graph tends to go down and then later it goes up. We're still learning. We don't actually know the answer to the question whether that is generally true, but there are many cases where it looks like that. And it's one of the kinds of things that we can eventually do. We basically need more help. There are more questions than we have people to answer them. So anybody who becomes interested in this kind of thing is invited always to help with the analysis, to help with good questions and so forth. But what's probably in the technical scientific sense, what's really instructive or important is a very strong consistency. That trend there is very consistent. That means that the deviation was constantly negative during that period of time, with the exception of one little blip in the middle. And similarly for this positive deviation here, that if we shifted the blue envelope of probability over, this would be highly significant by itself. But even, as I mentioned before, it doesn't have to be individually. These events don't have to be each one a hit, each one a proof by itself. But the accumulation of many experiences of a similar sort over time will show there is a consistency or there is not. If there is sufficient consistency, then we wind up eventually with a kind of strong evidence, not proof, but strong evidence that there is a correlation, a connection between the two kinds of things, the events in the world, the consciousness state, the global interconnection, and our data on the other side. Obviously, I'm now heading to 9/11 because these beautiful pictures turned into something entirely different. On September 11th, it was a horrifying event, shocking and devastating in many respects, some of which are still today resonating with us, unfortunately. This is a composite I did for a special purpose. It shows several graphs. I'll enlarge that show bigger versions later, but here's the 10. This is a certain kind of measure that's just looking kind of normal, wandering around. And then early in the on the 11th, around 5 in the morning, which is roughly almost 4 hours before the first plane hit at 8:45, the data take on a trend that is so strong it's unmistakable. This is the sort of thing that you don't need statistics for. That's highly significant by any reasonable measure. So the last tower fell at 10:30, and then after that, a half hour or so later, the same strong departure from expectations occurred in the opposite direction. So we have, on this day, a huge change from what's expected of these data. And then it comes down, and basically the next few days may or may not be really different. By at least one of our measures, the event that occurred on September 11th, in terms of our data, persisted for 2 days. And I can myself easily imagine or understand, I can recall my own shock and concern, dismay, and all that stuff going on at a strong, persistent level. Certainly our newscasts, and probably this is true in much of the world, even though the interest wasn't as 100% in other countries as it was in the U.S., it's clear that all over the world people saw this as a major event that might changed the world in a way it probably has. Here's just a couple of other views. As a statistician, this one on the right, which is a graph of autocorrelation. Autocorrelation is a technical name for a linkage from one moment to the next. I'm not sure I said this, but random sequences are defined by having no connection from one moment to the next. Each point in a random sequence is completely independent of the preceding point. So if you know one, you know nothing about the next one or anywhere down the line. On September 11th, that changed so much that for 2 hours, the data from these random sequences became predictable to a degree. It's shown by this red curve in the upper part. Truly random data look like this cloud of lines, which is a representation of the same calculation for 60 days surrounding. None of them even begin to look like that. So, we can, I think, fairly safely say that 9/11 is the most powerful event we've looked at so far. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any hypotheses about why the data started changing so far before the event? I know you mentioned it before.
Okay.
Seeing again.
Yeah, her question is whether I have any hypotheses about why the data might have started changing before the planes hit. There's two major possibilities in my mind, one of which I believe is the case, and one of which I think is, has some logic and maybe even contributed some. The one that I prefer, the explanation I prefer, is that the global consciousness, just as our individual consciousnesses do, has a kind of precognitive ability. We do have premonitions. As individuals, if we're open to them, sometimes they are helpful in guiding what we do next. This is the kind of thing that's very hard to prove in a scientific way, but by far the vast majority of people don't have a real problem with the idea that we can sometimes at least faintly see what's in store. We have precognition of the future. There's, in my mind, no reason why a global consciousness shouldn't also have that, especially if it's a big thing. And this was, as I think is clear, a very big thing. The other possibility is that probably around the time 4 or 5 in the morning that we see this beginning spike of activity, there's maybe 50 or 100 terrorists, people associated with planning or themselves committing themselves to die pretty soon, who are deeply engaged. And it could well be that their contemporary thoughts of feelings are spreading out in the world and being collected in our system as well. Both of those seem to me to be feasible. I prefer the precognition just because I like it better. I would rather not have the terrorists determine the way our lives are. This is another wonderful quotation from Teilhard de Chardin, and I think terribly, completely appropriate. If the age of nations is past, the task before us now, if we would not perish, is to build the earth. That means, let us come together. Let us recognize the oneness in which we all are participating, whether we know it or not. So I'm beginning now to move toward thinking about what's going on here. I think maybe there is such a thing as a consciousness field. I'll gradually talk more about that, and if anybody's got questions about it, ask, because sometimes that produces better responses or better descriptions than when I just talk about it. But I'm thinking that your mind, and everybody's mind here, has a field that extends out into the world. We've heard this already from several other speakers. I don't think there's any real doubt about that, even though it's hard to characterize. We don't know that we cannot yet write the equations readily for exactly what that looks like. But it's, I think, pretty clear that one of the components of a mind field, a consciousness field, maybe even in a certain sense the whole thing, is information, structure, which is present because of the mind, because of the field of consciousness extending out into the world. There's structure that wouldn't otherwise be there. So my mind has a kind of spreading information structure going out in all directions and probably out indefinitely far. And everybody else has one too. Our fields are normally not interacting in any orderly way because we're not thinking about the same thing. We don't necessarily even know the other person is thinking, even though we all are, always. But what happens when there's a big event that links us all to be thinking and feeling the same kind of emotions, things like compassion and love and so forth? What happens even if just two people meet? They really resonate with each other. I think what happens is that these fields, which are normally chaotically interacting, are suddenly now in phase. They're becoming synchronized. They're building a kind of new entity which didn't exist or wouldn't exist without the interaction of the two. You bring the two together in a third entity, the group, the global consciousness, the loving relationship. This is probably real. It's a real field made out of something like information, in which we probably should learn more about. I think that, in a way, is what this research points to, and probably the kind of the point of it, in a way, is to teach us that we should be looking for and maybe learning more about consciousness fields. Sometimes I mentioned we've been talking about really big news events, but there are some that don't hit the news, but which are nevertheless very big. Every now and then, I think it's every 5 years, in India, in northern India, there's a gathering of really huge numbers of people, and I heard anywhere from 4 million to 20 million people come together and try to bathe in the Ganges, a ritual religious purification. And this left-hand graph is what the day looked like on that day. During the time, these people are all in a huge, huge mass, engaging in a common, deeply important ritual from their religion. Here's on May 20th this year. This is the day before you were asking about, but there were huge numbers of people. We think the data show that the collected registrations show something like more than 500 million people. Excuse me, 500,000 people. Sorry, that was a mistake. But probably something on the order of 1 million people. Now, compared to the whole population, that's not so many. But what these people are now doing is very synchronized. And literally, this trace is what happened in the data during 3 periods of time, each of which was 3 hours long. One began at 4 o'clock, one at 10 o'clock, one at 2100 Universal Time, or GMT. So that's all combined to make this extremely steady trace, which is highly divergent from what's expected by chance. Yes?
Where did it go down?
The answer is still unclear. This is similar to the question she was asking about why did it go down first and then up. The tentative notion, and this requires more work to stabilize it as a notion or either prove it wrong or prove that it's probably a good explanation, is that the kinds of events where there's not an external driving event, but instead an internal production event, something like an intended meditation or this kind of the kind of thing that the transcendental meditation people do, bring all the city meditators together, sit in meditation, they expect the consciousness field to go out, extend out. Those kinds of events, not driven by emergencies or crises or even celebrations, are typically this downward trend. It's something like a calming. It's not, I mean, it's just, technically and literally in a scientific sense, we cannot say the data are more calm. They're really just more divergent, but the divergence is in this direction where the deviations, instead of being positive, are negative from what's expected. Yes?
As compared to going upward when it's such sad or destructive or
Yeah.
horrifying. In a way, it's almost what you expect.
Yeah, there are a number of things that we haven't done it yet, but we will. We have individually tried, let's say, categorizing the various events. I'll show a graph later of what that looks like. One of the things that appears to really produce strong, high-going trends is something like compassion and love. I'll actually show you some more data like that. Here's an event that is part of that database. In Afghanistan, there were these beautiful ancient Buddhas carved into the mountain. There were, I think this one was 50 meters high, really giant and ancient, 1,000 years old. The Taliban didn't want to have any competing religions represented, so they took artillery shells and bombs and just blew it out. And here's what the data looked like on that day. I don't know whether this is really because of what happened there, but maybe it is. Maybe, I know that at the time there were tremendous numbers of people from all over the world that did the best they could in every way they could think of to persuade the Taliban not to do that. And they did it anyway. This is the way the data looked at. I think people felt a deep loss, which isn't the same as compassion, but it's maybe a little like that. Compassion is something that seems to me to be inherent in any kind of attempts to restore the social fabric. Ceremonies and in holidays, they're often, compassion is involved. And certainly when there are great tragedies, I think compassion is naturally evoked. Here's a kind of, yes.
I see sometimes all the things. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes such mentioned the number of things.
I think you're asking about how many eggs are involved.
Why the difference, or if, for instance, we have a event in India, you would select the eggs around, or you take all the eggs?
Okay. I think you're asking, do we take all the eggs? And the answer is yes. Almost all the time we look at all the eggs, the combination of all around the world for any given event. Sometimes, just to learn more, we look at the eggs that are more local. For example, we look at the eggs in India for this celebration in India. Or we look at the eggs in the Katrina hurricane. We look at the eggs closest to the New Orleans for that. For the tsunami, we looked at the eggs closest to the tsunami. And sometimes it appears that there's a little more effect on the ones that are close, but most of the time it looks like the effect really goes all around the world. I need to sort of quickly go through a few more examples. This is an event that really amazed me. The Pope went in year 2000 he did a pilgrimage in the Middle East, and he was there for 6 days, and the data were shown in this red curve. The little green circles are places where he stopped and gave talks or met people. I hadn't seen a thing that lasted for such a long time, and I got worried that there was something wrong with the system. And so a week or 10 days later, I took the data and did the same analysis, and this black curve shows what normal random eggs should look like. So my interpretation is that was an occasion where people all around the world began to think maybe things will come together after all. So we have quite a few of these compassion, intents to harmonize and so forth. They tend to produce positive, strong results. Here's a contrast. Sporting events, things like World Cup soccer, they don't do that. Somehow it's just not what we need. There's excitement, but there's no compassion. There is competition. Yeah. It's going both directions, right? Same thing for political events. Again, there is competition, no coherence. You're way ahead of me. The terrorist bombings in Madrid. Some reports said that something like 90% of the people in big cities came out to protest, to say we do not want this kind of thing. City meditations. I mentioned that sometimes these meditations go backward, the city ones. Sometimes they actually go forward. Go figure. Who knows exactly how to explain it. But the most recent one we did, which had a lot of data involved, was last year in July and September. There were something like 2,000 people in various locations, all meditating. They're not trying to do anything, they're just meditating. And our data show this a strong departure from expectation. And there's a slight correlation with how many people are actually involved. You may know that the TN people predict that if the square root of 1% of people all meditate, then we will have a calming effect on the neighborhood where the meditation is happening. And they have data from social measures like crime rates and so forth that show a correlation with these city meditations. I promised a picture of New Year's. This is what New Year's looked like. We have to do this averaging across many time zones. This is represented here by an assortment of time zones. But when you add them all up, you get this very strong, very clear kind of departure from expectation. This is the bottom line kind of result over the last 9 years. We have now actually 240 events. The last one isn't in this chart yet. But what we see is instead of a random walk along this horizontal trend, we have some up, some down, but the tendency is for these predictions to be borne out time after time, so that by the time we have now accumulated 239 events, the probability is less than 1 in a million that this could be just a chance fluctuation. That for physicists want 5 standard deviations. This is 4.8 standard deviations, more or less. So we're getting close to the place where we can say, in terms of ordinary evidence, there's not much question. I understand we have only 5 minutes left. Is that right? So I'm going to kind of really zoom through the last few things, and I hope anybody who has questions will feel like asking. We have a lot more questions than we have answers. We do a lot of things in the background, like making sure the eggs all run right. See this, where the arrow there is? One of them broke. That was a cracked egg. Had to be replaced. The distribution, in terms of a mean shift, is fairly clearly shifted. But the amount is small. It's only 3/10 or 4/10 of a standard deviation. That's not significant if you look at one event. Only when you accumulate many events which have an average like that, you get something like a high statistical significance. Grouping into different categories, I won't spend a lot of time there, but demonstrations like peace marches and vigils, the relief at the end of a war or whatever, a celebration, religious ceremonies, acts of war, accidents and crashes. These are significant. Over at this end, we have things like promotions, web promotions, political events, anniversaries. 9/11, 2002, nothing. We thought we should look, but there's no effect. Not in 2003, not in 2004. So anniversaries don't do the same emotion. They don't evoke the same compassion, whatever it is. There is a slight correlation with distance. I won't go through details, but in both of these different kinds of measures, you can see there's a slight tendency from the closest eggs to New York City and to the farthest away in 2 different kinds of measures, but it's pretty ragged and not highly convincing yet. Positive events, are they better or worse than negative? Turns out both positive and negative ones have a strong effect. They're not different from each other, even though the bar is a little bigger for the positive one. The number of people paying attention, yeah, matters. The more people, the bigger our effects. But we have millions, or hundreds of millions, of people involved, engaged in the event, we get bigger effects. It isn't a surprise, but it is not something you can be sure of until you do that test. This is my favorite, the influence of, we had somebody go through three people have done it, go through the event and say, does this have compassion? A lot, a little, or none. And ones with a lot of compassion, however the person defines that, show bigger effects. Experimenter effects. Some of my colleagues say, oh, it's all just Nelson. Roger Nelson, in this case. I don't think so. There are a lot of reasons not to think that's the case. What happens if we look at data that is not exactly where the event is? If you move this way or that way from the event, what happens is that the effect diminishes, goes to basically to zero as you move away from the event. That shouldn't be surprising if it's the event that's doing it. This is exactly what we should expect to see. This is a little more complicated, but basically it's saying that there is a big difference in the time of the event and after the event. It happens that we have defined the event ahead of time in such a way as to capture one mood, I think, and then a different mood takes over, like I was talking about. First we're shocked, excited, fearful. Afterwards we're sad, resigned, whatever it is. Pardon? Yeah. This one, again, just quickly, we have eggs in. We're able to look at a band of eggs represented by these, earthquakes represented by these spots. They're on land. They affect people. They're big. They're Richter 6 and bigger. They cause damage. On the left is a picture of the data for those quakes, and this downtrend that peaks right at the earthquake time, that begins 8 hours before the earthquake. So, and this is what the quakes look like in the ocean. No connection there, no pattern. This is another kind of favorite thing. There's a background long-term trend over the several years. And I want to show you what might possibly be an explanation. At least it's very, barely possible. We have, this is a picture of the long-term trend in the data. This part of it is highly significant, and we didn't originally have any kind of explanation at all. So my friend Peter Bencel started looking around at polling data. We got presidential approval ratings, which were pretty much around the 50s and 60s early on. They drifted down after Bush was elected, but they shot up to 90% on 9/11. Then drifted down, and at the beginning of the Iraq War, they shot up again, not quite so high. And again, when Saddam Hussein was captured, and then we do some modeling, and we discover that there is an extraordinary correlation between these two things. Whether there's a real explanation, whether there's any kind of causal relationship, really isn't possible to say. But isn't that interesting? That we have in these random event data a trend which happens to correlate really rather strongly with a social measure. It also is suggestive of the thought that we might, around the globe, be feeling a little low because things are not moving in the positive direction as much as we might like. My prediction is that that curve will turn around in the next couple of years and probably peak out nicely in 2012. Now, I don't have time to talk about theory much, but I want to just show you one sort of generalized notion. David Bohm's implicate order, he talks about active information. Remember, I'm talking about information fields. Active information, in Bohm's terms, is really virtual. It doesn't exist in our world until it's actualized. It's actualized. It can be actualized. His model says it is actualized, becomes real when there's a need for it. If if you're familiar with his work, he talks about a pilot wave that's bringing the future into existence. That's essentially the same kind of notion. And when you start thinking about it, disease, the kind of thing that, or injury, it means that the normally beautifully integrated human system, say, is disordered somewhat. It needs some order. The healer has order. The healer knows about structure, is providing structure. It's a virtual information field provided by the healer, which can be absorbed and will be absorbed in this system that needs it. So the chaotic need for structure allows remote healing to occur by way of an information field. We're all generating information field all the time. Our eggs in this network are the same kind of thing. They're random, they have no structure, they're open, they don't care. So our engaged attention provides structure, which is absorbed and becomes the eventual, curves of deviation that we see. So we have a lot of work to do. We want to keep on going. We want to form better questions and then work on the answers. Last quote: "We take the world apart. What would it be like to take the world together?" Okay, thank you very much.